Welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week I speak with Maryam Younnes to discuss the collective trauma of not just October 7, but living in a war zone for over a year, and how this has both influenced Israeli society as well as hopes for a ceasefire agreement and a prospective peace deal in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Living in the West, we're so far removed from the reality of war. And while we might have many strong opinions about foreign policy and specifically the war in Israel, none of us have the perspective needed to understand this conflict in its entirety and how it has affected Israeli society. Maryam speaks to that beautifully, and I encourage you to listen to her story. Her story is one and is a testament to and a testimony to the betrayal that many Israelis have felt since October 7, not only from their Palestinian neighbors, but from the international community that has turned its eye or even denied the atrocities that happened on October 7, as well as the reality of living in a constant state of war for the last year. This is an important episode. I hope you enjoy. Maryam, welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm so happy to have you back.
Thank you for having me again.
I'm so excited. I just want to give all of your recent videos on our YouTube a shout out. You've been doing great. So I feel honored to have you on the podcast. Before we even hit record, which is going to kind of set the tone for what we talk about today, you asked if I could hear the booms in the background. Can you kind of set the scene for our audience? Like, what are those booms? What's happening? What can you hear?
Yeah, so right now I'm in northern Israel, in the city that I grew up at. And basically, we are in a war zone. I know that many people don't really understand or conceive Israel as a war zone because it's mostly, and unfortunately, it's like the other countries that are, mostly destroyed, like Gaza and Lebanon. But we are in a war zone here in Israel, and thanks God we have the Iron Dome, we have shelters. So in the past week that I've been home for the holiday, the Jewish holiday Sukkot, um, we had a couple of sirens that we literally woke up in the middle of the night or in the morning or whatever, like, running to the shelters. So in most houses in Israel there is shelter, like a special room that is protected from missiles. And then we have the booms through the day, like all day, every day. It's either the IDF firing missiles or just the interceptions of the Iron Dome. So it's like it's constantly in the background, and we are already used to it, to be honest. It's been a year like this. So in some places you'll hear it stronger, and in some places you'll hear it just in the background. But yeah, this is our reality since the 8th of October, actually. In other parts of Israel, this is the reality for years. Such an example, the envelope of Gaza, they have been living under the rockets of Hamas for years now, like since 2006 or 7, if I'm not mistaken, like when Hamas took over Gaza. And and in 2006, I was 11 years old. We had the second war, like the first war with Hezbollah, in 2006, and I was 11 years old. And yeah, it was very short back then. It was only 1 month. But yeah, this is just living in a war zone, casual, nonchalantly.
It's always really been almost jarring to me because it feels so unnatural when I've gone to Israel, just seeing how people do go about living their life and they are very casual about it just because you have to adapt in a war zone to continue your everyday life. So being from the West, or even like taking trips of young people from the West to Israel, there is just such a sense of trepidation or fear, which I do think is well founded. It's dangerous. It's a dangerous area. It's a dangerous zone. It's not a time of peace. But to see how Israelis have adapted to it is quite remarkable. Can you bring us back to October 7th? maybe even for the audience, because this episode's not about October 7th, it's going to be about living in a war zone and just the collective trauma that comes from that as a society and how you and other people, even in your generation, have dealt with it. But where were you on October 7th? How did you hear about it? And then how did your life change immediately that morning and then going into October 8th?
Wow. I mean, October 7th, I was actually at home because it was the last day of Sukkot. So it was Simchat Torah for the Jewish people. And it's actually this period, like I think tomorrow it's Simchat Torah. If I'm not mistaken, it might be tonight is like the holiday evening actually. So it's a year back, and I was sleeping, and then I don't know, usually I wake up super early, so I woke up like around 6:30, 7 ish, and I start, looking at my phone, and I was like, what? Like there are sirens in the envelope, in Gaza envelope, and suddenly, you know, the news started arriving, and no one could imagine what's going on. It seemed like a movie. No one could imagine what's going on. Like I literally remembering watching the news, panicking, literally panicking, not understanding if what we're watching is really happening. And then at the same time, like we got the news actually not from the media, we got the news from Hamas terrorists. Like I want people to understand that, because people tend to be like, oh no, this is all a fabrication of the IDF or the Israelis. But we got the news and we watched the videos on social media, on TikTok, and it was taken from videos that the Hamas itself and the terrorists were shooting on the ground. No one could believe that this is happening. No one could understand where is the IDF, what is going on, where is the police. That morning was, I think that the trauma we are still at, even though we weren't there, is still like we are still trying to understand it in a way, because it was a total chaos that lasted for a couple of days, not only one day. It took a while until Hamas was, eliminated by the IDF, and the Israeli forces managed to take over the area there. So it was like a mixture of not only, panicking, terrified, heartbroken, sadness. It was also, I was furious as well, because I felt like no one in the world showed any mercy or empathy toward what's going on in real life to people, to Israelis. I think this what hurt me the most now looking back at it.
I think what you said too, getting that initial news from Hamas and the POV web cameras that they used, could that also just be an initial form of the trauma? So to have the organization who hates Israel, vows to kill every Jew, every Israeli from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. There's almost this trauma that comes from the news of that coming from your enemy instead of coming from the government or Israeli news sources. Would you agree with that? Was there kind of a sense of trauma even from the beginning?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. I mean, just imagine the chaos the country was at. And then you get the news from these bloodthirsty men walking around, calling Allahu Akbar, literally showing themselves killing people in the worst way possible. I still remember, I'm sorry, did you hear this? I don't know if you can hear, but there
Yeah,
are
I just
booms
heard
in the
that boom.
background. Um, so I remember one of the first videos that I looked at, and I literally started shaking, was a video of Hamas terrorist holding a girl, and her pants was covered with blood, and they were getting her into a car. I remember shaking, and I started crying in like watching this. I was like, oh my God, what will happen to this girl? I was like, what will happen to this girl? This terrified me. And now looking back at this video or other videos, I'm like, what? Like, we were in a state of like, no one censored anything to us. Like, you know, it was all raw in front of us on social media, like kids, young people, parents that didn't know where their kids are at the Nova Festival. Like, we are still trying to understand what happened. It's still early to understand or to even try to conceive. And I'm talking about myself as if I was very far from that place. So just imagining the people that went through it, or families, you know, it's unconceivable to me.
It is. And I remember as well waking up in the United States, because it had already been obviously 7 hours ahead, to people in the United States being very confused, and just working in this space and doing news coverage and advocacy work responding to it. There was some really raw, uncensored videos, which then eventually got censored. But to see that very graphic imagery was emotional, even for me, being an American Christian who's not Jewish, not Israeli. So I can't imagine, to echo, you know, your remarks, your perspective, your reality, and then people who were in the South, and even just speaking to people from the South. I don't think there has been reflection on what happened, because Israel had to go directly into survival mode. But I want to circle back to what you said, the reaction and just the apathy from the world. I think it took less than 24 hours for people to either justify and celebrate what Hamas did, which is just so unbelievably evil. I still can't process how people here in the West not just deny it happened. We could talk about the denial of atrocities committed against women, and the UN ignoring it in a second, but just the blatant support that even people in American universities showed Hamas, and the justification. You know, we heard all the arguments, you know, Israel deserve this, what they think would happen. You know, it's an apartheid state. Gaza's an open air prison. It's a genocide. It was a legitimate form of resistance. It was really disgusting and intellectually even dishonest um, support from the United States. So, what did that feel like? So, not just the denial, but the overt support for Hamas as an Israeli. How do you even begin to grapple with that?
I feel like the thing that hurt most is people legitimizing terror acts as a way of resistance. No, it's not. These terror attacks happen to innocent civilians. Literally, not only innocent civilians, but people that believed in peace. And that morning, they wanted to take, paper planes and go to the border. And it's something they do very often there, white paper planes, to show the Gazans that they want peace. So to think about people legitimizing any any person that see any act of violence in front of him, and he's like, oh, but no, 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 there is no but. This is terrorism. This is violence. There are a lot of problems that need to be solved, but like legitimizing terrorism is just horrendous. I want to remind people also that people that were killed and slaughtered, they weren't only Israelis. There were people from all over the world there. People from all over the world, not only Jewish people, Christian people. I could have been there. Me as Christian, my background as Lebanese, whatever, I'm Israeli, no one cared. They killed a Muslim woman in a car, and her husband, he survived just by, it's a, I don't know, like he survived in a way to tell the story. And Arabs were killed, Muslims were killed by them. So no, this act and people legitimizing it is just terrifying to me, because it means that if this will happen to me or to anyone actually here, no one will stand for us just because we are Israelis, just because we are Jewish people, Jews. Like, this is mind-boggling to me. Like, it just, it hurts, and it doesn't make sense, and it just, seriously, like, not being able to feel empathy toward a person despite everything you might feel about him politically, socially, whatever, like, stereotypes you have about him, is just not human in any way, in my opinion.
Mhm. I think we see the dangers of extremism, both Islamism that justifies that from an ideological and a religious framework, and then in the West supporting it because we have a very post-Christian West and there's moral relativism, and
It's
we've
crazy
degraded.
that people don't even understand that even Islam, even in Islam itself, these acts are not supported. Like, even if you listen to other Muslims, not extremist Muslims, that explains the Quran and explains things that the radicals and the extremism, the Islamism, Islamist, like, legitimizing. You can see that on the other hand, like, I don't want to say real Muslims, but there is another point of view that forbid this. So legitimizing this as Christian, this hurts me even more. It just doesn't make sense.
Mm. Do you have any Arab Muslim friends who responded to October 7 in a different way than maybe the extreme left in the West and Islamist? What would they say about the attacks?
Yeah. I think every Muslim friend that I have, and even, obviously, Arab Israelis, like, Muslim Israelis, and friends that I know from all over the world, and also like, activists from the Gulf countries that were very vocal. Um, they were shocked, and I think that the 7th of October, it showed Muslims how bad they will be looked at because of the legitimacy that the religion is giving to these terror attacks. Like, I feel like even Muslims themselves, they were like, no, this is too much. This is not my religion. This is not what I believe in. Because we felt like there is a period that extremism and radicalism, especially in Islam, was like literally taking over places and cities, and we saw acts that we never saw before, and Muslims were okay with it. They were like, some people are like this. It doesn't represent me, but they weren't vocal about it. But then the 7th of October and the atrocities in the name of Allah, in the name of God, this made Muslims understand that, is this the way I want people to see me? Is this the way is this my religion? Is this what I believe in? And then we saw many people and many Muslims actually speaking up.
Mhm. I think your point too is important that a lot of Muslims were either apathetic or tolerant of extremism, and then we see it grow and then become legitimized. And I think that's a cautionary tale for us in the West as well, because our society is becoming very post-Christian, even anti-Christian, Judeo-Christian values, and a lot of people are very apathetic about it because I think they think that you know neo-Marxist extremism or postmodern extremism is it's on the left, it's in universities, it's not coming for us, but it eventually does kind of grow and then become legitimized and becomes a really big issue for those communities. Um, I want to talk about the apathy and not even apathy, the gross mishandling of speaking up for women on the part of the UN and then other women organizations or organizations focused even on gender-based violence in war. Of course, that kind of advocacy applies to every woman of every nationality around the world except for Israeli women. So we saw the UN completely turn a blind eye, even called for an inquiry into the accusations of rape or of gender-based violence. There's been many horrific accounts of even gender-based violence against men. Men were also sexually abused on October 7th. There's really horrific testimony of women's breasts being cut off, being mutilated. And that video you even reference of the woman with the bloody pants, it was very evident to anyone who saw even some of the initial videos that were coming out from October 7th that women were victims of horrific gender-based violence, which is a trademark in genocidal aims, which obviously Hamas does have those stated aims against Israel and against Jews. How does that add and compound to the collective trauma of Israeli society and of just women feeling safe within Israeli society, but even not even just in Israel, outside of Israel?
Yeah, it's just thinking about the blind eye that we got as women, as Israelis. I don't recall an organization talking about the women still held in captivity, by the way. I don't recall anyone showing mercy, empathy, any type of feelings about these girls and women that went through the worst, not only rape, by the way, but also women that their kids were kidnapped, and the elderly women that was in captivity. And it just thinking about this makes me not only furious but also again terrified, because it means that if something happens to me, there is no one to count on. Like, there is literally no international organization to count on, and this is terrifying to any woman, by the way, any woman around the world that right now is going through the worst. I didn't hear people talking about Sudan and what's going on there in the last year. I did not. And other places in the world that people are going through, and women specifically are going through the worst. The worst. Like the hunger that some parts in Africa people are handling right now. So I feel like the collective trauma of Israelis is also based on lack of empathy that we got from no one, basically. Maybe the first day people were like, oh my God, what's going on? But then the next day when Israel decided it will protect its civilians, the world lost it. And yes, I feel the pain of Palestinian women. I feel the pain of Gazan women that are paying a heavy price for Hamas atrocities. And it breaks my heart because I'm a woman. I'm a girl. I don't wanna even imagine going through what they are going, even though in 2000 when we were exiled from Lebanon, my mom tells me sometimes like some things that as a child, I was 5 years old, as a child I don't really remember being an immigrant or being a displaced, but we went through it, so I know what does it mean. I know. So I feel empathy and my heart breaks for any women or any men that going through literally hell because of war. But again, not having this empathy from the world, not having anyone saying, okay, let's put the political issue aside. We can condemn Israel in Gaza, okay, but we should as well talk about the kidnapped. We should as well talk about the atrocities of Hamas. And it seems like the UN forgot that Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's a terrorist organization, and they, like, them not condemning it and its atrocities, and not only not condemning but also like saying, oh, we're not sure, like, we need more evidence. What this is, I can't even start to think how the Israeli society will even start healing from this stab that the world stabbed it, and us as women, knowing that no one stand with us. It just, something that I can't even imagine what will happen, because we are still at a war. Actually, many forget it, but we are still at a war. So we are still in the 7th of October.
And as you speak, I feel like there's different phases of this collective trauma. Obviously, Israel has never really been at quote unquote peace. There's oftentimes little skirmishes in the south or in the north, and Israel always has to be on guard. And then October 7th happens, and there's that initial trauma just from the horror and seeing what's happening. And then there's this residual trauma of the world either being silent, denying it, or ignoring the call from Israeli women, ignoring the hostages who are still in Gaza. So there's this perpetual trauma. And I think your point is really important in that Israeli society hasn't even had time, I'm sure, to reflect on that, because having been in Israel during this time of war, even being there, there's a sense of we just have to get up and fight, and that is our resistance.
Survive in a way.
And survive. And so it will be interesting, I think, to see after the end of this war, which we pray is soon, um, to see how Israeli society heals. When you think of collective trauma, has that united Israel domestically? Because I think back to October 6th, and Israel was quite divided, bitterly divided, actually, in the summer of 2023.
Who remembers?
Yes. It's like it was really wild. Yeah, it was wild to see Israeli society on what the news was sensationalizing, but essentially saying what could be a civil war within Israel over the judicial overhaul reform plan. To then on October 7th, a lot of unity coming from just the fight to, okay, we need to survive, and we need to survive as an entire society. How has that both united Israel, and then are there kind of signs that society is going back into the more polarized factions? Is domestic politics in Israel still united in like a wartime frame of mind, or are we seeing like political divisiveness kind of coming back up?
No, I think that obviously what was going on before the 7th of October, it was the first time that the Israeli society witnessing this division, this political division, I have to note, and also some social division in a way. Just a lot of things that literally surfaced that the Israelis didn't expect to deal with, and then suddenly, a new government was elected, and everything just served, and it was really the worst period for the Israelis. And then the 7th of October happened, and as you said, everyone got into survival mode. This was, and since then, I think like maybe now it's less, but yeah, since then, especially that the 8th of October, we had another, front opened. Like first it was only Gaza, and then Hezbollah started opened the front in northern Israel. So yeah, after the 7th of October, it was like we are united now, and we need to be unified to fight and to survive and to bring back the hostages and to eliminate the terrorist organizations, and then everything else will be dealt with. But of course, through this past year, we faced a lot of political decisions that people didn't like, and still many decided to continue to go to the streets and protest, which is legitimate. Although for me personally, we are in a war, and it's very important not to show these divisions, especially in like a very sensitive time like this, that many enemies are looking at Israel and searching for any little tiny loopholes that they can get into. But I do feel that the Israelis as a society are very united and very strong, and the Jewish people, they understand that they need to be united against these enemies, because they literally have no other place. Like, if this happened in Israel, just imagine what is going on around the world. And we saw a lot of attacks on Jews around the world. So the Jewish people can understand and do understand the importance of being united, and they are very good at it. And I wish we, as Lebanese, or as the Lebanese people, or as Christians, I wish we could learn this from them, like to be united and to understand what are the how do you say, like the priorities. And they understand that, but they are smart enough to also be like, okay, we are at a war. It's crazy whatever is happening. We are all in survival mode, but we also understand that we can't let our political situation to get out of hand. So it's managed in a way, but it's very hard. So some periods through the past year, we've been dealing with a lot of, like, not only the war, but also some political issues that we were like, oh, like, we have this as well to deal with, like, please give us a break. So it's not easy to be an Israeli in this period. But I believe that just like Israelis and the Jewish people in general managed to deal throughout the years with, in my opinion, much worse problems. And even in their weakest times, they still managed to, I don't want to call it a win, but they still managed to protect Israel and protect their being. And I'm sure it will happen again this time as well.
Hmm. Is the government still in a wartime cabinet? Is that still how the
Yeah.
government is being operated? Okay. Um, and I think that also kind of mitigates a little bit of the political turmoil because there's not the chance of like an election or different parties kind of factoring off. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. It's not only a war, and it's not only like decisions that has to do with the war, but also a lot of political decisions that are happening in the government that many of us, we don't support, and we are trying to understand how to maneuver it. Like, we are at a war, but we don't want the government to, take decisions that we as the people, we don't agree on. So it's very, and also through the years, the government decided to just pass really important laws without really the ability to discuss them correctly. So people are wondering, like, citizens are wondering, like, how does it make sense to anyone? And Israelis, just like Israelis, they are, they know their rights, and they will always fight for their rights and for their democracy. And you will always see people in the street protesting, and people that criticize the government. So it's very, we are, sometimes I feel like it's too democratic, like the state is too democratic. But it's great. This is right that many around us don't have, and many in the world don't have. So we don't take it as granted, and we are very happy to, to use our voices and to use our rights, and to speak up when we should to.
Hmm. No, it's good to remember as well that Israel's the only democracy in the region. So even if it is hectic or there's polarization, it's still a blessing to be able to express your democratic rights and opinions and freedom of speech. Um, Speaking of like the term collective trauma, I feel like that's always reserved for the Palestinian cause. And it's very rarely recognized that Israelis have also experienced collective trauma because when the narrative emerges that Israel is the colonizer and the Palestinians are the colonized, obviously you're not going to recognize the powerful as having a collective trauma. So I think that narrative is really carefully crafted to delegitimize and politicize violence against Israelis and kind of silence Israeli voices, which again is just another form of delegitimizing um, and inflicting further trauma on Israelis. But thinking back to even what you had said about even on October 7th, people in the kibbutzim in the South who are peace-loving people, many of them welcome Palestinians into their kibbutz, which is actually how they had maps of the different kibbutzim. They worked alongside their Palestinian neighbors, and they were making efforts towards peace in a very, what we might call in the West, in a very hippie kind of way, a peace-loving kind of way, which is a beautiful kind of mindset. But how does what happened on October 7th, does that set back the hope for a lot of people in the South for there actually being peace? There is obviously a big betrayal that these people who had come and worked on their homes, or they had had over for peace talks, or just their neighbors, were the ones who helped target them on October 7th. I can't imagine that form of betrayal. Do you see that setting back what peace talks looked like before October 7th and just the conversation around peace and a two-state solution?
I want people to understand that it's been like terrorist attacks here in Israel was something that we've had through like all the years, the intifada, the first intifada, the second intifada. Like when people are calling for intifada, you are calling for, like, you are legitimizing the use of terror attacks against Israelis. So only last week we've had a terror attack, and then 2 weeks ago we had another terror attack, and these terror attacks has been going on for years. But while these are like, just, unfortunately I'm saying this, just like, casually happening, the 7th of October actually, it was a slap to the face of the left here in Israel. It's a hard slap. And I feel like whoever believed in peace, the 7th of October was the worst wake-up call, because it was like, look, they are waiting for the moment to kill us, to butcher us, to slaughter us. How can you trust anyone talking about peace and then attacking you? How can you trust anyone with anything, actually? Like, I feel like the next step before even speaking about peace is to try to rebuild or to build the crushed, not existent even trust between Israelis and Palestinians. There is no trust anymore. There is no trust anymore, because an agreement after agreement through the years, and it's been more than dozen of agreements signed between Israel and the Palestinians. The usage of violence and terror over and over again by the Palestinians just pushed the trust of Israelis further and further away. So again, how can you trust people that see violence as a normal way to not only fight you, but also like not respect any agreement you have signed with each other? So the 7th of October is like the left has shifted, everyone has shifted toward the right, unfortunately. And still, because of the fact that we are still in a war, I don't see anyone even speaking about peace. Like, I want to be very optimistic and say that I do believe in peace. I believe in the day after. I believe that we can build a better Middle East, but it's going to be very hard. It's a process. It's going to take years, and it has to be with the enforcement of, international, not only laws, but international power that literally eliminate terror and the usage of terror as a legitimate way to fight Israelis, or to fight the legitimacy of Israel, legitimacy that the UN gave Israel and the world gave Israel through the years. So saying that it's a legitimate way to resistant or whatever, it's just incorrect, and it doesn't do justice to the Palestinian as well. So So yeah, I don't see us talking about peace. It's still very early. It's maybe easier to talk about peace with Lebanon, but with the Palestinians, it's, I think, almost impossible.
Mm. And I think, as you mentioned too, there's a no trust environment now, even for the political left in Israel. And we'll see the political left in the United States often calling for a ceasefire. But there's no trust, I think. Not only are Hamas's demands for a ceasefire disproportionately favoring and empowering and legitimizing Hamas, which Israel quite literally cannot do because of their own security and their war aims, but there is a no trust environment that Hamas would even uphold their end of any ceasefire deal. So it's really difficult to come to a diplomatic solution to bringing the hostages home, which is really unfortunate. And I pray that there is one, but I think that no trust environment makes it extremely, extremely difficult.
The fact that Hamas themselves weren't clear and they weren't clear about or regarding the hostages. It's also something that, like, what agreement are you gonna do again with a terrorist organization? Like, we've seen what you've done, and you don't even have the integrity to allow the Red Cross to get to the hostages, or to give the people any information, not through heart-wrenching videos showing them in the worst conditions and terrified and terrorized. So it just think about it in a, like, even politically, like, how can any country accept to do an agreement with such people? How can you? It's impossible, in my opinion.
It's so sad. It's a horrible reality because obviously we're still praying for the hostages to be returned home in some sort of a diplomatic way, and if not through military means. Um, I really want to talk also about the cultural dynamics and maybe the taboos surrounding mental health and discussions about mental health. I know that there has been a lot of conversations about what the Israeli government has or has not done for the survivors of the Nova Music Festival, or even those that were in the kibbutzim along the south on October 7th and witnessed firsthand the atrocities that happened. I also do want to note and take a moment. Sherelle Golan, I believe I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She was a 22-year-old Nova Music Festival survivor who took her own life recently, I believe last week, on what was her 22nd birthday, as she battled the horrific trauma of October 7. And her family and her brothers came out and essentially blamed and condemned the Israeli government for not assisting survivors with the mental health services that they needed to process and move through that grief and that trauma. Um, Coming from a Spanish background, I know that there's cultural taboos around mental health. Um, and I would say that they haven't quite caught up with the times as far as normalizing it and making that a cultural conversation. Is that the same in Israeli society, in Arab society, in Jewish culture and society? Is that kind of similar? And does that hinder maybe the processing of the society with the grief and the trauma that they've experienced?
So I totally, like, coming from an Arabic speaker house, and obviously as a Middle Eastern, specifically in the Arab world, yes, it's very hard to talk about mental health. It's a taboo, actually. But I feel like in Israel, like, Israelis are very um, open to talk about this, just because, again, we have witnessed a lot of um, terror attacks and a lot of atrocities here through the years, and we've seen soldiers coming back from the battlefield in the worst conditions ever, and these issues came up through the years, so it's not a taboo. But I do feel that, yes, the government didn't put enough effort, again, because 7th of October happened and immediately we went into war. So that, like, everything, the whole resources went mostly to the war. So I feel like even if Israel, it gave some help, like a hotline, if I'm not mistaken, and like centers for the people to go there and talk, but it wasn't enough, and there were like too many people and too little assistant. And this is the price we see people that are dealing with PTSD. I can't even imagine, really. I can't even imagine, because only watching the videos of that day makes me having, like, I don't know, I shiver. So imagining people and young people who just wanted to celebrate and party, imagining them going through the hell they went through, and the PTSD they dealt with after that. And also the problem with PTSD, like I read in many places, is that it's very hard to prove that a person have a PTSD. And of course, with like scarce resources, the assistants need to kind of like make sure that you have a PTSD to give you the correct, help you need. So if you don't have any things that shown, and each person have different PTSD and different reactions and different ways of showing it, his suffering, so it's very hard to help all of them, unfortunately. So I don't think there is a taboo about this. I just think that there is a scarcity in the resources that are put to solve this problem. And we will see more and more of this, because right now in Gaza and in Lebanon, the soldiers are 19 years old and 20 years old. They are kids. I can't even imagine what they are seeing and witnessing and what they need to go through. So imagining them coming back, and I just hope that the, that Israel, the government, and the right, like the right institutions will actually take on themselves to help these people, and to actually manage to build a plan that, and you might think that, well, Israel have been through hundreds of wars, like we have a war every year almost. I'm exaggerating, but since its independence, the Israelis went through a war after war. So you think that the country is already, like, it already built a plan to deal with this, but no, actually, it didn't. Maybe because the people here are like, we survive, we move on. Like, we all have this mentality in the Middle East, like, we survive, we move on, no need to look back. Let's look at the future. We have worse problems to deal with. Like, it's literally something we deal with, all of us here in the Middle East. But I feel like now the country need to find a solution, because we see many young people that can't handle it. And just imagining this, just really heartbreaking.
How has society responded or reacted to Sherelle Golan's death? I know that for many people, it was just so tragic to see this beautiful young 22-year-old survive and then take her own life. Obviously, she experienced something so horrific that no one should ever have to experience. And then I think it also brought a conversation back up about the hostages, because I also can't imagine what hostages who have returned to Israel have experienced and what they're processing, and just hostages who are still there, the hell that they've lived in for over a year. I just can't imagine the psychological implications of that. So I think it re-upped a conversation about the necessity to bring the hostages home. But how did the larger Israeli society react to that news?
You need to understand, Dominique, that we've been grieving since the 7th of October. Like, we are in it's like it's our default feeling. Every day soldiers are dying. Every day, like, people are still held hostages. So it's a constant, bad news, and constant um, news about another people, mostly soldiers, killed, and people that are hurt from the missiles, and so on and so on. So it just, we are numb at this point. It's sad to say, but we are numb because this is our reality. Like this, it has been a year that this is the only news we hear, so it's just very sad. It's heartbreaking for all of us, but we are literally numb to it. Like we just hope that her death will teach the people up there a lesson, and they will try to do something, at least try to do something to handle this. And hopefully other organizations that are operating now will put more effort, not that they are not doing enough so far, but will put more effort and try to find other ways to help these people, and hopefully that other people that are struggling will be able to come up and be like, listen, I'm really struggling and I can't handle life. And like, hopefully they will open up. I hope so. I really hope so. Because again, it's just heartbreaking to see a young girl deciding to, give up her life. It's heartbreaking. I don't know if someone could have helped her, and it didn't, and maybe she didn't get the right help that she deserved, and maybe she didn't, I really don't know, but I hope that it will be a lesson and more effort will be put in this, because it's really heartbreaking.
It is. And may her memory be a blessing and also help others prevent a similar outcome. In closing, what do you want, or what would you say to the Western audience that largely watches this? What would you say to them about the importance of supporting Israel, helping the war come to an end? I think in the West, there's a fatigue. Like, even if you look at the news cycle, no one talks about Israel anymore. Like, the second October 7th happened, it was like, okay, it's been a year. That's about the attention span for a news cycle in the United States. There's a US election coming up. So I think a lot of people are fatigued. We have a lot of our own issues in the United States right now. And so there is a bend towards being pro isolationism. Israel's their own country. Let Israel deal with their own wars. What would you say to the West of just the importance of supporting, and even Christians talking about uniting Christians in the West, praying for Israel, for all Israelis, Jews, Christians, Muslims? What would your message be? And just what's your hope that they understand about your experience this last year?
I'd like to say that the 7th of October happened because Hamas is still not ready to accept the legitimacy of Israel being a state. And I want to say to people in the West, especially, that we have moved from 48. We are in 2024. Israel is a legitimate state, already big, she has like a lot of years that she has been legitimate, and you need to understand that you are not supporting the Palestinians by encouraging them to use violence against Israel, which is a state, a very strong state, that will use its power to protect its civilians, as it should. In order to solve this problem and solve this conflict, you should push the government and the countries to work on not only encouraging the talks of legitimacy of Israel as a state, but also like, how can we help the Palestinians to create a country, not a country that's based on, we will take Israel one day. No, it's a country that, you have your own land, you have your own territory, and you build your your country on it with the support of international powers, and eliminating terrorism. No one can support terrorism anymore. This must be like, this have to be the end of terrorism, especially against Israelis and especially against Jewish people, unfortunately. And third thing is advocating against extremism and radicalism. You guys don't understand that Israel is fighting terrorist organizations, whether it's in Lebanon with Hezbollah, and we talked about it before, and whether it's Hamas in Gaza. And it's heartbreaking because we see how these organizations are literally killing their own people because they don't care. They have this ideology in their mind: we will eradicate Israel, and this is the only thing they believe in. This is the only thing they think of. This is the only thing they invest in, and we see the results of it right now. It's this war. So I hope people could understand this and understand that the solution is not, like, Israel is not going to disappear. Israel is a legitimate state. It has its own citizens, and it's a very strong state, actually. And supporting this narrative is not going to help any side. Actually, it's just going to encourage another cycle of violence, another cycle of wars, another cycle of death. So these 3 points are very important, and very, in my opinion, as I see it, the ones that people should focus on when electing and when, thinking how can we even solve the conflict.
I just want to remind anyone who's listening who supports Hamas as a legitimate form of resistance for the Palestinian people, or as a legitimate mechanism to create a Palestinian state, of the human cost to supporting such a radical idea and ideology on both sides, for both Israelis and then also Palestinians who suffer under Hamas. So, Maryam, thank you so much for all of your wise insights and words. I can't wait to have you back on the podcast. Can you tell our audience where they can find all of your work and content?
Yeah, you can find me on TikTok and Instagram as Maryam Younnes, and also on Twitter. And you are more than invited to write me, ask more questions, share your thoughts, or even suggest other subjects you'd like to us to talk about and discuss. So yeah,
Thank you so much, Maryam. It was so great talking to you.
thank you, Dominique.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Philos Project podcast. If you would like to learn more about U.S. foreign policy and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict specifically, I encourage you to check out our fully subsidized Pathfinder courses. I'll put a link to that in the description box below. I encourage you to follow Maryam for updates on what's happening in Israel. She's a wonderful and trusted source coming out of the region. And as always, like, comment, and subscribe if you feel so led to give to educational offerings such as the podcast here at the Philos Project. I will put a link in the description box below if you feel led to give, and I will see you next week.